A routine trip to the grocery store turns into a moment of reckoning when an elderly woman tells a young black man to go back to Africa. The room falls silent. Tension crackles in the air. But instead of reacting with rage, he does something no one expects. He responds with quiet power that stuns everyone around him. What he says next doesn't just silence the crowd, it starts to change it. If you feel drawn in, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we have a story that will leave you speechless. It was an ordinary afternoon in a quiet Ohio suburb. The grocery store hummed with the gentle rhythm of everyday life. Carts squeaked down familiar aisles, distant beeps from checkout lanes rang like background music, and the scent of fresh produce lingered in the air. Shoppers moved with quiet purpose, focused on lists and dinner plans. It was the kind of place where people knew each other by name, where hellos were exchanged without urgency, and the most dramatic event might be a child reaching for candy in the checkout line. Daryl, a tall, soft-spoken young man in his 20s, blended easily into the crowd. Dressed in a plain blue hoodie and jeans, he carried a handbasket filled with groceries in one hand, his phone in the other, checking a message from his mother about what kind of bread she wanted. He was calm, polite, just another customer moving through a space that should have been safe until it wasn't. Near the apples, an elderly woman adjusted her glasses. Her hair was neatly pinned back, her cardigan pressed and tidy. At first glance, she looked like someone's sweet grandmother. But looks, as the moment would prove, meant little. As Daryl reached for a bag of oranges a few feet away, she turned to him. Her face tightened, her voice loud enough to carry across the aisle, cut through the ambient noise like a blade. "You people don't belong here." The words landed with a thud. Heavy, sudden, crude. Daryl froze mid-motion, fingers hovering over his screen. A silence spread around them like a ripple in still water. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. A mother steered her child away. A man near the potatoes stared, wide-eyed. Others avoided eye contact, pretending not to hear. But it was too late. She wasn't done. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The words weren't whispered. They were flung, brazen and unapologetic. The stillness that followed wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, like air had been pulled from the room. Like time had paused to ask, did that really just happen? Daryl didn't speak right away. His brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a line. He stood perfectly still, his entire body absorbing the weight of what had just been hurled at him. He didn't flinch, he didn't shout, but his silence spoke louder than anything yet. Around him, shoppers stood like statues, some too shocked to move, others too unsure of how to help. Even the banana stacking employee froze mid-motion. No one had a script for this kind of moment, and yet everyone understood something terrible had just been said. And what happened next, how Daryl chose to respond, would define far more than just a grocery trip. It would define character, it would define courage, and it would leave a crowd, maybe even a nation, speechless. The silence around Daryl was almost unbearable, not because of the words that had just been spoken. They were ugly, yes, but not unfamiliar. No, what made the moment heavy was the way everyone was waiting. Waiting to see what he'd do. Waiting to see how he would break the silence. Waiting to see if the stereotype would be fulfilled or shattered. He could feel the weight of every eye in the store pressing against his back. A mother with her toddler tucked close. The young cashier craning her neck. The teenage stock clerk standing rigid beside a crate of bananas. All of them frozen in a kind of suspended judgment. Not of him, necessarily, but of what might come next. And Daryl felt it. The fire. It burned in the pit of his stomach, in the pressure behind his eyes. The wanting to say something sharp, something that would slice right back at the woman who had so casually tried to reduce him to a place he'd never even been. He could have shouted, could have matched her bitterness with rage. He could have said what everyone was secretly thinking and walked out triumphant. But what would that prove? He'd spent his life walking this fine line, being black, being calm, being aware of how quickly perception could shift with a raised voice or clenched fist. He knew too well that in moments like this, fairness didn't always follow fury. So instead, Daryl did what strong men do when the world dares them to break. He breathed, a deep, slow breath that steadied him, that reminded him he wasn't just responding to her. He was responding to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had been called less than, everyone who had swallowed their anger to protect their peace. His fingers shifted around the plastic handle of his basket. He straightened his posture, standing tall but not aggressive, firm but not threatening. His shoulders rolled back slightly, not in defiance but in grounding, like a tree that had survived storms before. And then he spoke. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low and composed, slicing through the room with quiet authority. "Do you even realize what you just said?" It wasn't an accusation, it was a question, one that invited her to think, not to defend, one that gave her an opening, even when she didn't deserve one. She didn't take it. "I said what I said," she replied sharply. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." There it was, the full ugliness of it laid bare. No disguise, no euphemism, just hate in its rawest form. A few people in the store gasped. A woman near the bread section visibly flinched. Even the employee who had been frozen in place seemed to take a step forward, unsure whether he was allowed to intervene or not. But Daryl, he didn't flinch. He didn't step forward. He stepped inward. In that brief moment, he revisited every lesson his parents had ever taught him. Every time his father had told him, "You don't have to shout to be heard." Every time his mother had whispered, "Sometimes silence is power, but sometimes truth needs a voice." He realized then, this wasn't just about him. This was about something larger. This woman, whether she realized it or not, had handed him a microphone, and he wasn't about to waste it. He shifted the basket to the floor with quiet care, the gesture deliberate, controlled. Not a threat, just the opposite. It was the act of a man clearing space not to fight, but to speak. When he looked up at her again, his expression wasn't angry. It was anchored. He had made a choice. Not to stoop, not to strike, but to stand tall and teach. "Let's talk about that," he said, voice steady as a preacher delivering a sermon. "Since you brought it up." He didn't look around, but he could feel the crowd drawing closer, invisibly, breath by breath. Something in the air had shifted. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses. Witnesses to a man who had every right to explode, but instead chose to illuminate. And as he began to speak, slowly at first, drawing from the generations before him, he wasn't just defending his presence in that store. He was defending his place in this country, his family's sweat, his grandfather's war, his father's labor, his mother's love, his own restraint. All of it distilled into a single moment, delivered not in fury, but in truth. Because Daryl knew something that woman didn't. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and when it does, the whole room listens. The store had never been quieter, not because of fear, but because something sacred was unfolding. Daryl stood there, not as a man responding to hate, but as a voice for generations whose stories were rarely told aloud. His tone didn't waver. It didn't rise in anger or fall in hesitation. It was even intentional, like the weight of history itself was guiding his breath. "You said I don't belong here," he began, locking eyes with the woman, his voice steady as stone. "But let me tell you about where I come from." There was no arrogance in his voice, only truth. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi, a sharecropper. He worked land he didn't own, under a sky that offered no mercy. He broke his back so his children could have the chance, just a chance, to walk free one day. He didn't have much, but what he had, he gave, and he stayed, despite everything, because he believed that someday this country would be better." Daryl let that settle. "My great-grandfather? He fought in World War I. No headlines, no parades, just boots in the mud and blood on his uniform. He came home and wasn't allowed to sit at the same lunch counter as the men he fought beside. But he stayed, because he still believed in something bigger than hate." Someone near the dairy aisle put down their phone. An older man leaned on his cart, blinking hard. "My grandfather," Daryl continued, "was sent to Europe during World War II, risked his life for a flag that barely recognized him when he came home. He couldn't vote in parts of the South, couldn't use the same bathroom as his white comrades, and still, he wore that uniform with pride. He paused then. A beat, the kind of silence that carried weight. My parents, they weren't soldiers. They were warriors in a different way. My mom's a teacher, 30 years in classrooms, shaping kids' minds. White, black, Latino, rich, poor. It didn't matter. She poured herself into them. My dad's a mechanic. Hands like leather, heart like gold. He's the guy who'll stop on the side of the road to help a stranger, even someone who might look at him and think he doesn't belong. Now the woman looked down, her hands gripping the apples in her cart a little tighter. Darrell didn't press. He simply kept going, each word layered with pride and purpose. You think I'm not American? My family has bled for this country, built this country, believed in this country, when it gave them every reason not to. He wasn't preaching, he wasn't attacking, he was inviting everyone to see the truth. I didn't come from Africa. I came from generations of men and women who endured this soil, fought for this soil, raised children on this soil. And you know what's crazy? They never gave up. They never stopped hoping that someday someone like me could walk into a grocery store, in any city, in any state, and just be a man buying oranges. A woman near the bakery wiped her eyes. I am not asking for your approval, he said gently, and I don't need your permission. I belong here, not because I'm angry, not because I demand it, but because my ancestors earned it, and their sacrifices have been paid in full, with blood, sweat, service, and grace. He paused again, then looked beyond the woman, to the quiet faces now watching, not with judgment, but reverence. This country isn't perfect, but it's mine, just as much as it's yours. And I will not let ignorance erase the legacy of those who came before me. They deserve better. We all do. He stepped back, lifting his grocery basket off the floor, his voice softening but losing none of its strength. You can try to send me away with your words, but the roots I stand on, they run deeper than you'll ever understand. No one moved. Not at first. Then a man near the meat counter whispered, Amen. Someone else clapped, once, then again. And soon, like the quiet breaking of a spell, the room filled with soft, deliberate applause. Not the kind for performance, the kind that honored truth. Darrell nodded, not as a man who had won an argument, but as one who had honored his name. And as the elderly woman stood silent, her expression unraveling into something between regret and realization, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Darrell had said enough. For a moment after Darrell finished speaking, the store stood in stillness. It wasn't the frozen silence of before, born from shock or fear, but something deeper. Reverence. People hadn't just heard his words. They had felt them, each one settling into their chests like a quiet truth that had been waiting to be spoken for far too long. The elderly woman who had triggered it all was no longer the center of the moment. She had become still, her shoulders slightly hunched, her eyes no longer defiant but confused, perhaps even ashamed. But this was no longer just about her. Darrell's words had shifted the spotlight away from confrontation and toward something far more powerful. Community accountability. A man in a faded baseball cap was the first to break the silence. He stepped forward, slow but sure, and said simply, He's right. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It cracked slightly as he added, We've got to be better than this. Behind him, an older woman near the frozen food section nodded, pressing a tissue gently to the corner of her eye. My daddy fought in that same war, she said softly. He always told us the only color that mattered was the red on the flag. A quiet murmur rippled through the aisle, like a tide beginning to rise. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. Heads began to nod. Faces began to soften. Shame turned into solidarity. From the cashier station, the young woman who'd watched everything unfold raised her voice slightly, calling out from behind her register. That was the most graceful thing I've ever seen, she said. Thank you for saying what needed to be said. She didn't look at the elderly woman. She looked straight at Darrell, and her words sparked something that had been dormant in the others. Permission to speak. It wasn't a wave of applause at first. It was small gestures. The deli clerk offering a slow, deliberate clap. A mother gently squeezing Darrell's arm as she passed. A man placing a hand over his heart. Simple signs. Silent acknowledgments. The clapping grew, not thunderous but sincere, not performative but earned. They weren't applauding a speech. They were honoring restraint, courage, and truth told without venom. And still, Daryl didn't bask in it. He simply nodded in gratitude, his eyes scanning the crowd not with pride, but with something more humble. Hope. The elderly woman shifted on her feet. Her voice, when it finally came, was no longer sharp. It trembled as she began. I didn't mean... But the sentence trailed off before it found its end. Daryl turned toward her again, not as an opponent, but as a man who had already said everything he needed to say. His voice when he spoke next was even softer than before. It's not about what you meant, he said gently. It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more. She didn't reply, but her eyes lowered and her grip on the cart loosened. And maybe that was enough, for now. Behind her, others began to move again, but differently. Conversations started. Strangers made eye contact. Someone said, "We see you," and someone else whispered, "That took guts." There was no parade, no camera crew. But in that grocery aisle, a community had started to change. Not all at once, but together, because they'd seen something that wasn't just right, it was necessary. A man who could have shouted had chosen to stand. A man who had every reason to be furious chose dignity instead. And in doing so, he gave permission for everyone to be better. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the atmosphere lingered, lighter, warmer, changed. Daryl lifted his basket again, nodding quietly to those who had spoken up. He didn't smile big. He didn't need to. The respect was in the silence, in the gestures, in the way the store had come to life, not with noise, but with awareness. For the first time since the incident began, he took a full breath. And the store breathed with him. The sun was setting by the time Daryl pulled into his driveway. The sky glowed in shades of copper and lavender, casting long shadows across the street, a soft contrast to the weight of what had happened earlier that day. He stepped out of the car with a quiet calm, the grocery bag in one hand, the experience still settling in his chest. Inside, the house smelled like fresh coffee and oil from his father's garage. His father, a man of few words and quiet wisdom, sat at the kitchen table sipping from a chipped mug, his calloused hands folded around it like a prayer. Daryl sat down across from him and began to recount the day, not dramatically, not with resentment, but with reflection. He spoke about the woman's words, the tension, the silence, and then about what he said. His father listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed, taking in every word like it mattered, because to him it did. When Daryl finished, the room sat still. "You did the right thing, son," his father said at last. His voice was low, firm, steady, not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. People like her, they don't change overnight. But you planted something. That's all you can do sometimes. Plant the seed and let it grow. Daryl nodded slowly. His father had lived through a different time, one of separate fountains and hard lines, and yet even now his belief in slow change remained unshaken. Across town, in a quiet dining room filled with fading light and untouched food, the elderly woman sat alone. Her grocery bag sat by the door, the apples still inside. Her fork hovered above her plate, but she couldn't bring herself to eat. Daryl's words, calm, composed, and undeniably true, echoed through her mind. She remembered the way he had spoken about his grandfather's war, his mother's students, his father's kindness. She thought of her own grandchildren and the world they were inheriting, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something uncomfortable settle in her chest. Doubt. Not self-pity, not shame, but the raw, vulnerable feeling that maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong. She didn't know if she'd ever see Daryl again, but if she did, she hoped she'd find the courage to say what she couldn't say earlier. "I'm sorry." In the days that followed, the story of what had happened in that grocery store began to spread. Not because someone filmed it, not because it went viral, but because truth like that doesn't stay quiet. People talked, not about outrage, but about grace, about how a young man had faced prejudice and answered with history, strength, and compassion. Strangers approach Daryl in line at the post office, at the gas station, at church. "Thank you for what you said," they tell him. "You reminded us what courage looks like." And yet Daryl never sought praise. He knew that moments like those weren't about applause. They were about impact. Because real change doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it starts with a calm voice, a steady presence, and the courage to tell the truth, even when your hands are shaking. And maybe that's the lesson worth carrying, that words matter. That silence can be broken not by shouting, but by speaking with purpose. And that when one person dares to stand with dignity, it gives others the permission to rise too. Sometimes the most powerful moments come not from confrontation, but from calm clarity. This story of one black man standing tall in the face of hate isn't just about defending dignity. It's about choosing to lead with wisdom when the world expects anger. What Daryl did wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was deeply just, profoundly human, and undeniably necessary. His voice, steady and unshaken, cut through silence with truth, and in doing so, created a ripple far beyond that grocery store. These are the emotional stories we need to hold on to. These are the narrated stories that help us see ourselves and each other more clearly. Stories like this remind us of the quiet strength that lives in all of us. They show us that justice doesn't always roar. It sometimes whispers with grace and still changes hearts. If you've ever been moved by touching stories or found courage through incredible stories of dignity and resilience, then let this be more than just something you read. Let it become something you share, a seed of change in your own conversations, your own community. Because in a world often divided by noise and fear, truth told with grace becomes a force no hate can overcome. So reflect, share, speak kindly. And if you feel inspired by this journey through Unraveled Fates, stay connected. There are more justice stories to tell, more voices to honor, more hearts to reach. If this story meant something to you, don't keep it to yourself, share it. Someone else may need to hear it today.